So I could give you today's sermon, message, lesson, whatever you prefer to call it, in 7 words. 7 words. What you sincerely seek is always revealing. As I was sitting in meditation this week with this idea of this talk, that's what came, and I thought, that's it. Do I need to say anything else? That's a good quote. What you sincerely seek is always revealing. It's revealing that which you are seeking, but perhaps even more so, it's revealing a lot about you and why you may be seeking that particular thing and may not even know that that's what you are seeking. We're going to dig into that a bit today, as this week is the 4th week in a series, a 4-week series that went 5 weeks. I have a friend that says it takes me an hour and a half to watch 60 minutes. It took us 5 weeks to get through a 4-week series. We needed to do 2 weeks on one. But this series comes from the Vedic tradition, the Vedic scriptures. The root of the word Veda means to know. And what we've been using as a guide for these 4 weeks are called in the ancient Vedic tradition the 4 yogic paths, the 4 paths of yoga. But now again, in this ancient Sanskrit, the definition of the word yoga was different in many ways than it's perceived today, because the ancient Sanskrit yoga means what? Union, oneness. It's about union. And so the series is about knowledge of our divine union. The individual soul is an expression of, an inlet and outlet, a part of universal spirit. And so having the two become one. We started the first week with the first pathway, which is known as the path of action or service. It's known as karmic yoga. The scriptures always say, do unto others as you would have them what? Do unto you. It's about being an instrument, being of service. Gandhi said the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in service of another. So we explored that as the first one a few weeks ago. And how being of service, seeking to be an instrument of whatever it is you're wanting to express, is a way that leads you to discover that sense of oneness. The second week, we talked about Bhakti Yoga, which is the path of devotion, essentially meaning love. The greatest scripture, we were told by Jesus, is to love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. But the common thing there is love. And how it is love that takes the self, the ego, the individual beyond ourself to discover the cosmic self, we could say, the essential self, who we really are as an expression of all that is. So the path of service and then the path of devotion. Last week we talked about the path of meditation, Raja Yoga. Meditation and mindfulness of closing the door and going within. Coming to discover that sense of awareness that we have experiences, we have sensations, we have these things, we have our stories, but they do not have all of us. That there is that within us. There's a pure awareness that is part of all that is, and you can discover that through prayer and meditation. We had a challenge or an invitation last week for you to spend 7 or 10 minutes a day for 7 days in meditation. Did anybody make it all? That's actually pretty amazing. Thank you all for doing that. And if you didn't yet start, I encourage you to do so, to give it a try. I promise you, you will find out your mind has a mind of its own. And there's a lot that can be discovered. So we've looked at those 3 paths, and today is the final path, known as the path of knowledge, by realization of truth. Now, when you first hear that, the path of knowledge, again, using today's language, we may think about how many of you saw on the news this week the little boy that won the world spelling bee challenge. Man, that little guy could spell and he was so fast. That's incredible knowledge. But it's not that kind of knowledge we're talking about. I had a little niece that could name all the presidents and name all the capital cities before she started school. We're not talking about that kind of knowledge. I know people that are really, really good at math that can just calculate numbers in their heads. Not that kind of knowledge. Even individuals that may be able to see and predict things. We're not even talking about that kind of knowledge. The path of knowledge is the path of self-realization. It's really about turning the light within continually, asking questions, challenging your own beliefs, your own assumptions, paying attention to your feelings, your biases. It's paying attention to all of these things, asking questions. It's also seeking higher understanding for the purpose of spiritual enlightenment and realization. So that's the kind of knowledge that we're talking about in this context. The pursuit of a spiritual insight, you could say. All of this comes from the Vedic tradition, but if we look over and say, well, what do the Jewish or the Christian scriptures say about that? Well, Jesus had a lot to say about it. But beyond saying it, he was a master teacher of causing people to think with this kind of desire for knowledge, and we'll get into this. But in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verse 7, one of the most well-known scriptures, Jesus said, "Ask, and ye shall receive. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and the doors shall open." He's talking about ask, seek, knock, and find, receive, be opened. This is not passive. This is an active, ongoing seeking about the inquiry of oneself, is really what it comes down to. In unity, we have a classic story. Goes back to the foundations of unity. This is the impetus for what caused unity to even be conceived of. The people that we call the co-founders of unity are a couple named Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. They lived in the Kansas City area, the Midwest, back in the mid-1800s. Myrtle Fillmore was a mother of 3 boys. She had been sick a lot as a child, sick as a young woman, sick quite often a lot in her life. A lot of the women in her family had been sick, died early. The medicine, the science of that time, there was a lot of emphasis on, how you was largely dependent on what you inherited from your family. And so Myrtle Fillmore, married, 3 boys, is very sick. She has a number of diagnoses, but the most critical is tuberculosis. This is somewhere around 1848-ish. Quite often that was a death sentence. And she'd had it a while, and she was getting gravely ill. The doctors told her she had only weeks, maybe a few months to live. Very, very sick. And she had just always felt like, gosh, this is going to happen. I've been sick. I've inherited bad genes. But someone invited she and her husband to go hear someone who was traveling through town giving talks. His name was Dr. E.B. Weeks from the Chicago School of Metaphysics. And something in her said, I know I need to be there. And so with the help of friends and her husband, they got themselves there that night. And as Dr. Weeks began to give a lecture, and in the context of his lecture, at one point in time, he said, I want you all to know you're a child of God, and therefore you do not inherit sickness. You inherit the life of God. Now you can imagine Myrtle Fillmore, who was basically on her deathbed, had been carrying around that fear and that belief. When he said that, she later wrote that every hair on her arm stood up, chills ran down her back. Something within her said, yes. How many of you can recall a time like that? It happens in grand ways and in subtle ways throughout our life. It's like a truth bomb or something just is said, and other people may not even notice it, but it strikes a deep chord in you. And that's what happened for her. She heard something. Well, she began to work with that idea. She began to pray for herself in a different way. She began to say, I am a child of God. I inherit the life of God. I'm a child of God. I inherit the life of God. And as she would say that, it led her to speak other words of truth. Over the period of about 18 months, she was completely physically healed. She lived to be in her late 80s. Throughout the course of her life, though, many people would ask her about that miraculous healing, and it was, in many ways, a miraculous healing. But she was always mindful to say, the greatest healing demonstration I have ever had was the healing of an error belief about who I was. That the greatest healing was the healing around me coming to know myself as an individualized expression of that which we call God, and that the activity of this power of God is operating within me. That's a beautiful example of knowledge. When things happen that cause us to look at ourselves differently, to think about ourselves differently, to ask different questions. In Proverbs 4:7 it says, in all your getting, get understanding. It's meaning that in all that you seek and all that you get and all that you obtain, get understanding of who you are first and foremost. I once read that on a prison wall, these words were carved. And the words are, it's not the answers that enlighten, it is the questions. It's not the answers that enlighten, it is the questions. And so in our journey towards self-realization, knowledge of our true self, we have to first of all realize that we can only see only what we can see. How many of you know there are things that you don't know? I hope you do. How many of you know there are things that you don't even know you don't even know? How many of you would admit there's some things I don't even want to know? That's probably true. That's the beginning, is realizing I don't know it all. I know it from this perspective. There's a beautiful saying, and there's a picture of a frog down at the bottom of the well. And that frog is looking up, and all it can see is one circle of the sky. And the saying says, the frog thinks the whole world is that. But if it could surface, it would see that there's so much more than that. Different traditions teach us that we're trying to move beyond the illusion, move beyond the surface, to see that there's so much more than we currently can see. And that's our primary journey. So whatever we are sincerely seeking is revealing itself to us. So let's just think a minute about, we want knowledge. I think if you are in this room today, if you're tuning in today, you definitely have an interest in spiritual understanding. You're on that path, you want that. But are many of you aware that you still have some blind spots and blocks, and we get stuck in places? So to realize that that's part of it, and to ask ourselves, what are some of these things? Well, we begin by realizing we all have our internalized beliefs and what I call hand-me-down beliefs. I came from a big family of cousins and extended cousins, and I got hand-me-down toys, hand-me-down clothes, and I got a lot of hand-me-down beliefs that I just kind of took on for myself. It's like the Sunday school teacher that asked the class, how many of you believe in God? And every hand went up. And then the teacher said, why do you believe in God? And every hand went down. Except one finally went up. And when the teacher said, why do you believe in God? That little person said, well, I believe it runs in my family. So it's to realize that there's a lot of stuff that it's just how we grow up, how we are indoctrinated even in our own family. And so we make assumptions. We draw conclusions. It also, quite frankly, is part of our survival. When you look at the news at night and you see the pain of people being displaced from their homes, you see the hurt that is going on, it becomes almost so much to bear that we sort of create these walls and we just tune it out. Because if we really started looking and saying, that could be my grandmother, that could be my grandson, that could be my sister, that could be somebody I love dearly, when we start relating at that level, it almost can become too much to bear. And so we protect ourselves and we just begin to distance and numb it out. We also live within paradigms and this is just the way it has always been done, and we may not challenge it. Many people live with what we would call unquestioned allegiances. There's a lot of that taking place in our country right now. There's blind allegiance, unquestioned allegiance. And we may have some in our own life in varying ways and in different ways. So to turn the light within and to say, if there's any place, how am I doing that? There's a word that's found in the Bible called slothful. It basically means lazy. But what it's referring to is we're lazy because we're not tending to the portal of our mind. We're not tending and paying attention to, why do you believe this? Why do you believe that? If this is the holy book you follow, do you know its history? Do you know about the Council of Nicaea? Do you know actually how it got here? Do you know those things? Are we doing the work to know why do we believe these things or not? Other things that would hinder our self-knowledge is we don't want to deal with our shadow. That painful stuff, that ugly stuff, the stuff we'd rather not have to ever look at. We just keep it buried. But what I tell people in counseling is you can try to do that, but I'm here to tell you it's buried alive. It's not just laying there, it's buried alive. So just be aware if you buried it. We often sometimes then lose our curiosity. We just kind of get tired. Or we're too busy to really go deep. And another real big one is so many people, and so often, especially in different areas of our life, we don't hold ourselves accountable to radical self-honesty. Lying, little white lies, half-truths, manipulating information is so commonplace. We actually lose our own self. A lot of people, if you ask them, how do you feel? They'll give you a surface answer, and then if you say, but how do you really feel about that? A lot of people will stop and say, I don't really know. I don't really know. I've never really thought about how I actually feel about that. And so all of these things are part of what it takes in order for us to be able to go deep, to truly know ourselves. And then to realize that whatever we're seeking, the questions that we're asking, something is seeking to be revealed. Whatever is drawing you, calling to you, those things matter to you for a reason, and it may not be the reason you think, but those things are drawing something out of you or bringing something to you. There's an example we talked about a few weeks ago, and I want to expand on it a little bit. There's a parable that comes from the Gospel of Luke that's called the parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with that parable. But I want us to listen to it maybe with fresh ears. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? So let's pay attention. The question he's asking is, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus replies, well, it's written in the law, so how do you read it? And the man who asked the question said, well, the law says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, correct, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But the man said, so, exactly who is my neighbor? Love your neighbor. So does that mean I need to love people that believe like I believe, that look like I believe, that are in my tribe? Does it mean geographically I have to love them because they're within a certain region? So he's asking Jesus, exactly who is my neighbor? Now think about this kind of question. When you ask the question, who is my neighbor? What you're really wanting to know is who is an insider and who is an outsider. Who do I have to include and who can I exclude? Who is worthy and who is unworthy? This question, who is my neighbor, is really a bit of a divisive question. It's different from the first question. The first question is, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And so, as so often Jesus did, now he goes into a story. So the man has just said, so who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now that audience would have gone, ooh, because they knew the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was filled with lots of twists and turns, a lot of bandits hung out there, a lot of people got robbed. It wasn't a safe road. So he says, there's a man who traveled from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was attacked by robbers. The audience is like, yep, I know I'd never be on that road. That would happen. They stripped him of his clothes. They beat him. They left him there half dead. Then a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed over to the other side and kept going. Now to us, we hear like a minister or Catholic priest, and we think, oh my God, that's horrible. But we don't know what it meant to them. They had cleanliness laws, and if that man was on the way to perform something, he could not have touched that body without rendering himself unclean. So we don't know for sure how the audience replied. We just know that the priest passes over and moves on by. And then it says, and close after, a Levite came by. He too crosses over and does the same thing. Well, once again, we don't know because Levites work in the temple. He could have actually been following the priest and working with him. We just know neither of them stopped. But this is where the real twist comes in. He says, and then a Samaritan traveled. He came where the man was. He saw him. He took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, poured oil and wine to care for him. He took the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn to care for him. The next day he took out money and gave it to the innkeeper and told him to look after him and said, when I return, I will reimburse you for any expense you may have had. Now to us, that doesn't sound so outrageous. Let me try to put it in a story today. So let's say we're telling this is a modern day story. Someone's traveling on a road. A minister passes by, a politician passes by, and then a drag queen passes by. And the person on the ground is Oral Roberts. The minister just passed right on by Oral Roberts. Politician just passed right on by Oral Roberts. But the drag queen, who has been lambasted by this very man, takes the time to care for him. Not only goes through the motions, but literally helps tend to his wounds, gets him up on his donkey, takes him into town, gives some money, and says, take care of him. That's the extent of the audience would have been feeling that kind of juxtaposition, like it just didn't make sense. Because in that culture, Samaritans were outsiders, they were half-breeds, they were unclean. And to have touched another person would have been a violation of the law. And so Jesus, when this very first question begins, how do I inherit the kingdom of life? And then, well, who is my neighbor? He gives this whole story. So then he looks at the man who asked the question and said, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of the robbers? Which of these three was a neighbor? And the man said, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Now remember, the opening question is, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And the answer that comes back to him is, always ask yourself, am I being a good neighbor? You see, that's a much better question about, now who is my neighbor? Because we can debate about if they're on this side of the wall or that side of the wall, if they wear this color or that color, if they are this color or that color, if they believe this way, they believe that way, if they're kind, if they're unkind. Exactly who am I supposed to extend and call and consider a neighbor? Jesus totally flipped it around and said, don't worry about that. The question is, am I being a good neighbor? Can you see how when we begin to turn those questions around, things begin to radically change? I've had so many of those things happen in my own life. When you think you know something, you know how it is, and then something just begins to chip away at that belief system. I grew up in eastern North Carolina in the Pentecostal tradition. Many of my family members were ministers. I loved church. My whole life, I've never known a time when I didn't go to church. It was just a part of my DNA. It was a very different experience. But our family were very musical, went to church, worked hard, loved God, and enjoyed Southern fried food. That pretty much loved each other, would sum it up. And so I grew up in the church, and I had a very belief system that I was very blessed because I happened to have been born into a family that got the right religion. How wonderfully blessed I was that ours was the right one. And it was part of my job to help tell everybody else how theirs was wrong in a loving way. And then by the time I'm in high school and you're asking different kind of questions, I had a very good friend who was Catholic. And I was always concerned for her because, according to my beliefs, she was damned for hell. And she just had the best heart and spirit, and she would laugh about it. And she'd be like, the worst I'm ever going to get is purgatory. Don't worry about me. I'll be good. And I'm like, no, that's not a thing. That's not in the Bible. And one day she told me all about Mother Teresa, and I was really impressed. Now, this was when the best access you had was a library, and maybe you owned an encyclopedia. You could not go online and Google Mother Teresa. But she told me about Mother Teresa and how she was taking care of the poor. She had given her whole life for this. And my friend looked at me and said, and you're telling me that Mother Teresa is going to hell because she doesn't believe like you believe? And I said, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's how it's going to work. And I began to think about that. I thought, well, gosh, that's just kind of wrong, isn't it? And so I remember that night at the dinner table, I asked my mom. I asked her, told her about Mother Teresa and blah, blah, blah. And I said, Mom, she is so sincere. I just can't believe she'd be going to hell. And my mom said, honey, she probably is sincere, but she's sincerely wrong. And not in a bad way, it's just the way she believed. But when my mom said that, the thought that bubbled up in me was, what if we are sincerely wrong? You hear me? That day as a high school child, something cracked. And I really believe it's because I do love what I've called God. I've wanted to be about that. Something began to crack. It wasn't long after that, I got invited to start working with Women's Correctional Center. I went with a women's group and some young teenagers. I was able to go into the correctional centers where we would sing and have fellowship. I just loved it. I loved being in and doing that. Fast forward until I turned 21. I had done this, and I guess they'd recognized I was doing it. So the local facility recommended my name to a man by the name of Bill Glass. Bill Glass was a former football player, NFL. and he started the Bill Glass prison ministry. After he retired from the NFL, he became an evangelist, and he wanted to take his contacts through sports with other Christians and go what he called behind the walls to deliver that message. And so I, at 21 years old, got an invitation to go travel with Bill Glass Prison Ministry, go down to Dade County, Florida, with him and the Harlem Globetrotters. I'm like, I am in. Just one trip, I'm signing up to go one visit. So we get on the bus and we're driving down. And have you ever been so excited about something and then you got on the bus and then you're like, what am I doing? This is a maximum security prison. I'm 21 years old. I have no idea. Let me get off this bus. That was a lot of the ride to Florida going on inside of me. By the time I got there, I was terrified. I had my Bible. I was trying to remember every scripture and afraid I was going to get killed because I had in my mind these maximum security prisoners. They must have one glass eye and I'll be really, really mean. And I just had this incredible something in my head. And when I got there, it was so different than I anticipated. I was blown away. They put me with some of the younger women, and my first thought was, these women look like they could be at the mall. They look like normal women. That was the first thing I had to have my realization. I had a lot of naivety and just believed things were so black and white. As we began to interact with these women, and again, a lot of it was singing and group fellowship. So my last day there, my heart is full. I'm so happy. We're lining back up to get, and I saw the Harlem Globetrotters play basketball in person. That was pretty amazing. And so we're lining up in person to get back on the bus to come back. I'm talking to some of the women, and the guards are with us. I just said, this was so different. I really enjoyed it. And I said, as a matter of fact, if I wound up somewhere like this, it really wouldn't be that bad. I'd gather people around, and we'd sing, and we'd do this, and we'd do that. And a guard kind of chuckled and stepped up, and she said, honey, that's why you'll never be in a place like this. She said, you'll never be in a place like this because you think like that and you can see possibilities. There was another really big chink. Because you see, I had seen them and us. I had seen believer and non-believer. And now somebody just pierced me with words of truth that said, do you realize what a gift it is that you can think creatively? Do you realize what a gift it is that you could see how to gather people around and cause them to come together and work together and sing together? She said, that's why you'll never be in here. You can see those things. That's what the Spirit of truth is always showing us things if we're paying attention. I'm going to ask the band to come up because I want to show you about a 4-minute video of a very powerful story that really brings this home to me.
I was a blue-eyed.
Do any of you recognize the name the Reverend Fred Phelps? When I was in Kansas City, I came to know who he was. Fred Phelps was a disbarred lawyer. He had been a civil rights attorney. And he became a minister of the Westboro Baptist Church. When you see this video, you'll recognize some of this. He and his family, mostly he had a very large family, kids and grandkids and a few congregants. They were the ones that were protesting at funerals, at any kind of gay event, Jewish, Islam. They were showing up on Howard Stern and in the newspaper, and their message was, God hates. They were really elevating a message of God hates. But what I want to show you is a short video of Fred's granddaughter and how a person who, even if you've been so steeped and think there is no way to ever see differently, there really is. If you open your heart and you truly do want to do what is highest and best, And if you're willing to have a sense of curiosity, to be curious, to be kind, and to be most committed to the discovery of truth and not about being right. So watch this short video.
I was a blue-eyed, chubby-cheeked 5-year-old when I joined my family on the picket line for the first time. My mom made me leave my dolls in the minivan. I'd stand on a street corner in the heavy Kansas humidity, surrounded by a few dozen relatives, with my tiny fists clutching a sign that I couldn't read yet. Gays are worthy of death. This was the beginning. Our protest soon became a daily occurrence and an international phenomenon. And as a member of Westboro Baptist Church, I became a fixture on picket lines across the country. The end of my anti-gay picketing career, and life as I knew it, came 20 years later, triggered in part by strangers on Twitter who showed me the power of engaging the other. In my home, life was framed as an epic spiritual battle between good and evil. The good was my church and its members, and the evil was everyone else. My church's antics were such that we were constantly at odds with the world, and that reinforced our otherness on a daily basis. Make a difference between the unclean and the clean, the verse says. And so we did. From baseball games to military funerals, we trekked across the country with neon protest signs in hand to tell others exactly how unclean they were and exactly why they were headed for damnation. This was the focus of our whole lives. This was the only way for me to do good in a world that sits in Satan's lap. And like the rest of my 10 siblings, I believed what I was taught with all my heart, and I pursued Westboro's agenda with a special sort of zeal. In 2009, that zeal brought me to Twitter. Initially, the people I encountered on the platform were just as hostile as I expected. They were the digital version of the screaming hordes I'd been seeing at protests since I was a kid. But in the midst of that digital brawl, a strange pattern developed. Someone would arrive at my profile with the usual rage and scorn. I would respond with a custom mix of Bible verses, pop culture references, and smiley faces. They would be understandably confused and caught off guard, but then a conversation would ensue. And it was civil, full of genuine curiosity on both sides. How had the other come to such outrageous conclusions about the world? Sometimes the conversation even bled into real life. People I'd sparred with on Twitter would come out to the picket line to see me when I protested in their city. A man named David was one such person. He ran a blog called Julicious, and after several months of heated but friendly arguments online, he came out to see me at a picket in New Orleans. He brought me a Middle Eastern dessert from Jerusalem, where he lives, and I brought him kosher chocolate and held a God hates Jews sign. There was no confusion about our positions, but the line between friend and foe was becoming blurred. We'd started to see each other as human beings, and it changed the way we spoke to one another. It took time, but eventually these conversations planted seeds of doubt in me. My friends on Twitter took the time to understand Westboro's doctrines, and in doing so, they were able to find inconsistencies I'd missed my entire life. Why did we advocate the death penalty for gays when Jesus said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone"? How could we claim to love our neighbor while at the same time praying for God to destroy them? The truth is that the care shown to me by these strangers on the internet was itself a contradiction. It was growing evidence that people on the other side were not the demons I'd been led to believe. These realizations were life-altering. Once I saw that we were not the ultimate arbiters of divine truth, but flawed human beings, I couldn't pretend otherwise. I couldn't justify our actions, especially our cruel practice of protesting funerals and celebrating human tragedy. These shifts in my perspective contributed to a larger erosion of trust in my church, and eventually it made it impossible for me to stay. In spite of overwhelming grief and terror, I left Westboro in 2012. In those days just after I left, the instinct to hide was almost paralyzing. I wanted to hide from the judgment of my family, who I knew would never speak to me again, people whose thoughts and opinions had meant everything to me. and I wanted to hide from the world I'd rejected for so long. People who had no reason at all to give me a second chance after a lifetime of antagonism. And yet, unbelievably, they did. The world had access to my past because it was all over the internet. Thousands of tweets and hundreds of interviews, everything from local TV news to the Howard Stern show. But so many embraced me with open arms anyway. I wrote an apology for the harm I'd caused, but I also knew that an apology could never undo any of it. All I could do was try to build a new life and find a way somehow to repair some of the damage. People had every reason to doubt my sincerity, but most of them didn't. And given my history, it was more than I could have hoped for.
And a powerful story. Sarah, read me this. So the story goes on. I encourage you to watch the entire talk. Long story short, today she is married to the Jew, David. How divine order shows up in the midst of all of it. Whether the path is a path of service, a path of devotion, a path of meditation, a path of knowledge towards realization, I think we can all agree that how we show up, remembering to be kind, to listen, and to seek to learn every step of the way is one of the greatest things that we can do. This week, our practice, if you will, is to really begin to turn within and to ask yourself a couple of questions. What can I learn from this? When things are going on, number one, what can I learn from this? And how can this deepen my understanding of my true nature and the divine? What can I learn from this? And how can this deepen my understanding to my true nature and the divine? And I promise you, if you will let those questions guide you, then you will find that what you are seeking will be actively revealing to you. Sarah.
I ask and I receive. I seek and I find. I knock and the door is open. I remember, and I am home.
Would you sing it with us?
I ask and I receive. I seek and I find. I knock and the door is open. I remember and I am home.
Sing it out.
I ask and I receive. I seek and I find. I knock and the door is open. I remember and I am home.
So I invite you to close your eyes just a moment. And so we give thanks. We can each look back over our life and recognize places where we've been so idealistic. Quite often, it doesn't come from pride. It comes from a limited experience of the world. But then we can get so entrenched in our being idealistic that it can then begin to be rooted in pride. We can all look back and see how we've held beliefs. We perceived things, we understood things, we thought things were a particular way. And then something happened. Something happened that put a crack in that belief and allowed light to come in. And there was something within you that was willing to do one of the most difficult things on the face of the earth, and that is to let go of a belief. Because so often your belief is so entangled with your sense of identity and well-being that to give up and let go of a belief feels like you're literally losing yourself. And yet you've done that. And so we each have and ask for the courage to hold our beliefs, our opinions, our perspectives, our understanding very lightly, realizing that, yes, this is the way I see it and I perceive it and I understand it now. And I realize that this is just the way I see it and understand it now. And so we're willing to offer it all up. And in the offering is the becoming vulnerable in a sense that allows the heart to be elevated. It's to allow the true self to emerge that says, I am that I am. And above all, I am seeking for this pure expression of my being to rise to the forefront. May love rise to the forefront. And may the questions that I ask be questions that will always be guiding me. How may I show up here as an expression of love? What do I need to know in this situation that fosters love and connection? What do I need to see? I ask and I receive. I seek and I find. I knock and doors are opened. I remember and I am one. I am home.